Hello and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. We have been taking a look at the various aspects of postmodernism, particularly the ways in which postmodernism is defined as a philosophical and cultural theory that rejects totalizing narratives in favor of partial, fragmented and incomplete ones. And in today's session, we shall also be focusing on how the idea of the postmodern challenges and questions the very idea of the aspect of reality behind and beyond representations. And in the various facets in which postmodernism is being represented, we shall also be further analyzing how the general idea, the general condition of postmodernism is suspicious of truth and focuses on the production of truth in language and narrative. And this is again something that we've already taken a look at in our previous discussions, ranging from Barthes' Death of the Author. And we've also noticed a very strong post-structuralist stance, especially in the early stages of defining and framing postmodernism. And this is particularly evident in the works of Lyotard, Deleuze, and Baudrillard. And there's also a general distrust of finalizable meaning that we can find in their approaches towards postmodernism. And something that we could identify as being common to all of these theorists is the fact that they have all extended the concerns of post-structuralism about science, meaning, and context of meaning production in order to make sense of what postmodernism is and in order to make sense of the various postmodern representations regardless of genre, media, and the context. The objective of today's lecture is to particularly take a look at Baudrillard and his work on hyperreality and how that has come to define the various aspects of contemporary postmodern representations. If we try to approach Baudrillard in a rather simplified manner, it would not be wrong to say that Baudrillard had compiled a theory of representation, arguing that nothing exists outside representation. And according to him, hyperreal is a world of simulations and excessive science, and it's also the only real world, according to him, that we will ever know. Because the postmodern condition, the postmodern representations make it rather impossible for us to know the real for real. We only have certain simulations which are accessible to us in the form of not reality but hyperreality. In Baudrillard's own words, there is an escalation of the true, of the lived experience, a resurrection of the figurative where the object and substance have disappeared. When we begin to talk about Jean Baudrillard, one of the first and foremost things that comes to our mind is that he is a French post-structuralist thinker. And interestingly, he is also classified as a postmodern theorist by Raymond Selden. And he is someone who questioned the tenets of both Marxism and structuralism. In that sense, we can find a number of common traits across these post-structuralist thinkers who are also being identified as postmodern thinkers. We saw a similar characteristic being reflected in the writings and in the ideologies put forward by Lyotard as well. And we find that Baudrillard at a later stage turning to a critique of technology in the era of media reproduction. And again, we also realize that just like Lyotard talks about the postmodern societies as advanced computerized societies, we find Baudrillard talking about the advanced society as a contemporary postmodern society as a society dominated by the technology of media reproduction. A number of Baudrillard's writings have been identified as provocative and apocalyptic, and in that sense he has also enjoyed an intellectual cult status in the postmodern period. At the same time, when we analyze the writings of Baudrillard, it's also important to note that he does not provide solutions through his discussions. Rather, he remains as a critical observer of the contemporary of the postmodern condition and also analyzes and critiques how the technology and the media of the postmodern period has affected human lives, culture, and the notion of reality and history in general. Perhaps the most significant work of Baudrillard is Simulacra and Simulation, published in 1981. This is also considered as the first influential work written by him. And in this work, he talks about the depthless world of unreflecting images and also about the image creating postmodern communication technologies. Particularly, he talks about the television and the various self-generating images across the postmodern surface. And according to Baudrillard, the television is a strategic site, a gigantic simulator. And much of Baudrillard's work concerns the ways in which technology, and particularly media and television, how they act as an interface to present reality to the contemporary audience, and also how they mediate the reality in such a way that it becomes almost impossible to know the difference between the media projected reality and the reality as it is experienced every day. And what Baudrillard finds interesting and rather alarming is also the fact that after a point it becomes almost impossible to experience reality without this mediation by these technology dominated sites. The other important works of Baudrillard were published in the late 1980s and 1990s, and they title The Consumer Society Myths and Structures, America, The Illusion of the End, and The Conspiracy of Art. There are a number of other works also that Baudrillard composed, and there are also a number of critical commentaries available from the 1990s onward. And interestingly, all of these works were originally written in French and they were translated into English at a later point. And across these works, we find that Baudrillard sees postmodernity repeatedly in terms of the disappearance of meaning, of inertia, of exhaustion and endings, whether of history or subjectivity. And this is how Raymond Selton talks about the contributions of Baudrillard to the ideas of postmodernity. And according to Baudrillard, in the contemporary, in the postmodern period, everything is obscenely on display. So much of his work in that sense continues to engage with the various aspects of reality as it is being represented, as it is being made available to the public. Quite interestingly, many of Baudrillard's observations were also considered quite controversial in the contemporary, especially this article titled "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place" had also drawn a lot of flack from a number of critics. Nevertheless, this work needs to be located as a significant work in analyzing the Gulf War situation against a postmodern condition. And this work, this essay is in fact part of a series of 3 articles that he published between January and March 1991. The original, it was published both in French and English in a French newspaper titled Liberation and in the British Guardian. The first in this series was titled "The Gulf War Will Not Take Place." The second one, "The Gulf War is Not Really Taking Place," and the third one, "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place." And here we find Baudrillard not limiting himself to certain abstract critical theoretical figurations, but he moves on to a different level altogether, critiquing the contemporary media, culture, and the notions of history and reality. And he also engages in a rather political discourse by using the theoretical and intellectual frameworks of postmodernity, particularly the aspects of simulation, simulacra, and hyperreality that he coined. About the Gulf War, Baudrillard made this rather provocative statement: "It is an unreal war without the symptoms of war." And in his own analysis, the war was conducted as a media spectacle. And he also argued that the real violence was thoroughly overwritten by the electronic narrative, by simulation. And he also argued in the context of the Gulf War that the media had set the agenda of the narrative of the war, and which was also made possible through a number of propaganda imagery. And this is not to say that Baudrillard denied the happenings of the war or contested whether the war actually happened or not. On the other hand, what he was trying to critique was the aspect that the entire scenario was an atrocity which was masqueraded as war. And this was being made possible only because of the media intervention, because according to him, this was a carefully scripted media event. In reality, it was a virtual war, because the details of the war were always propagated, were always given to the public through the eyes of the West, through the viewpoint of the West. There was no way through which one could know what really happened on the at the war front, except through these mediated narratives which were presented to us through the electronic media. And this obviously had invited a number of critiques from various other political theorists and also from other critical theorists. Nevertheless, this continues to be seen as a very prominent example that in which Baudrillard talks about the various interventions being made in the aspect of reality through the various postmodern devices. And here it becomes important to talk about these 2 notions that Baudrillard introduces in his work, simulacra and simulation. And at some level, it would be possible to say that Baudrillard actually provides us with both a theory of how we construct and simulate reality, and also offers a social and cultural critique of the contemporary. And this is evident in the way he talks about the Gulf War situation. And when he talks about reality, and it is not at a metaphysical level. On the other hand, he draws from sociology, media studies, semiotics, history, and philosophy. In that sense, it's an interdisciplinary, rather a multidisciplinary approach that he takes in his critique of reality. We talk about the pragmatic critical aspects of the work related to simulacra and simulation. We can also say that Baudrillard uses this framework to criticize various aspects of American culture, the consumer culture, the intervention of television into the contemporary, about capital, about science, and about politics in general. So the idea of simulacra, simulation, and hyperreality could be seen at two levels: as merely as a theory, as an intellectual framework, and also as a framework to critique contemporary socio-cultural scenario. And if we try to differentiate between these two terms, simulacra and simulation, simulation is a process in motion. It's a process in which a representation of something comes to replace the thing which is actually being represented, to such an extent that the thing which is being represented becomes more real than the real thing. So here we also enter into a confusion as to which object is the real one, whether the represented object or the object which is being represented through various media. And on the other hand, simulacrum, or the plural being simulacra, refers to a more static image in comparison with simulation, which is a process. And here we find that the sign loses its relation to reality, and the simulacrum becomes a copy of reality which has already lost its presence, eminence, and meaning. And there is also the possibility of the existence of a copy without an original, the most popular example being one of Disneyland. Here we also note that the term simulacrum was originally used by Plato to talk about a false copy of an art form. And when we talk about simulacrum, and when we give the example of Disneyland, there is also a challenge which is being posed to various notions of reality. Because earlier there was this notion art being something that reflected reality, but here in the postmodern period, with the intervention of technology, with the intervention of media, we have reached a condition where it becomes impossible to differentiate the real from the copy. And we also reach the next stage, which is being projected in the example of Disneyland, where we also have a copy without an original. The copy itself becomes a meaning rather than a representation of something else which originally had a meaning. And this leads us to the term hyperreality, which Baudrillard uses to talk about the division between the real and the simulated object. And hyperreality becomes a reality when the distinction or the division between the real and the simulation has collapsed, because an illusion of an object is no longer possible and the real object is no longer there, as we've already noted in the case of Disneyland. And also he gives the examples of television and photography to talk about how there is no way to access to any reality beyond the image itself, because we are caught up in the world of image and its copies, and it is no longer possible to distinguish the real from the copy. And this crisis and this confusion of the contemporary is designated as a hyperreal situation. We can see this process getting manifested in a number of contemporary events, including a number of movies such as Matrix and Inception, and also in various other contexts which are being dominated by the electronic digital media. This, interestingly, though, is the reality of the contemporary. There is a way in which we can trace its intellectual tradition. And it's quite fascinating to know that Baudrillard himself quotes in his work from Borges' work, a 1935 short story, which is in fact just a paragraph story that Borges had written about on inexactitude in science. So let's read out this short story together. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the cartographer's gills struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire. and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclement seas of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. Here, Borges tells a story about an empire for which a map was built, which also occupied the province in an entirety. And as and when the empire decayed, we also notice that the map was also found in ruins and in tatters. And here in Borges' story, it becomes rather impossible to see whether the map is a copy or an original of the empire, because there is a way in which the map and the empire collapses into one, and it becomes almost indistinguishable from one another. Baudrillard uses this idea from Borges to talk about the various aspects of simulacra and simulation, and interestingly, this is something that we continue to see in the contemporary. For instance, we see a number of images in which the copy becomes the original, whether it's a painting by Raja Ravi Varma which adorns a calendar, or whether it's the image of Che Guevara which is portrayed in a t-shirt, or even a Nike swoosh which is reproduced in a locally manufactured product. We find that it becomes difficult to say whether these images are being cloned or copied from an earlier copy, or whether these images by themselves are originals. And the postmodern, in fact, becomes characterized by this endless circulation of the copies, as Pramod Nair puts it. And we also find that it is a rather difficult task to delineate the copy from the original, and eventually the copy itself becomes the original, because it becomes a rather futile task to go on a pursuit to identify the original from these endless circulation of the copies, and it really does not make any difference in the meaning making process either. And if we extend the analogy of Borges' maps in the postmodern age, we find that the maps of reality, television and film becoming more real than our real lives itself. And we also have seen a number of occasions where the television characters emerge as being more alive than the real person who is playing the character. And this all eventually leads to the death of the real and a condition of hyperreality, which Baudrillard begins to lament in his works. But we also see that there is no escape from this condition of hyperreality, from this death of reality, as we've been seeing in the postmodern age. In connection to this, it's also useful to recall a work by Walter Benjamin published in 1935, an article entitled The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And here Benjamin engages with a series of changes that had come about in the age of mechanical reproduction, particularly in the aspects related to art and the way in which art is being engaged with and the art is being analyzed and judged. And to quote his own words, "For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. To an ever greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense, but instead, the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production. The total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics." Certainly be a useful exercise to read all of these texts together in order to see how there is an inherent connection in the intellectual traditions which are emerging, and how the contemporary society, the changing nature of technology, affects the ways in which art is being conceived, and also how the ideas of authenticity, and as we saw in the previous lecture, how the ideas of legitimation also undergoes a radical change with these innovative technological practices. The example that Walter Benjamin gives about a photograph, about the inability to identify the authentic print and how that's a futile and a useless exercise. It's also related to the various things about reality, hyperreality, simulation and simulacra that Baudrillard foregrounds. And subsequently, we are also left with an impossibility to know the reality apart from this image, the copy or the photograph which is being made available to us. The endless circulation of copies eventually become not just one of the ways, but the only way through which we can access reality, because we are also at a loss to figure out what constitutes our knowledge of reality. And also it leads us to this question whether we know anything other than the image or the copy which is being made available to us. And this process of image making, which Baudrillard also terms as simulation, becomes more important than the real, because how do we know the real? Or is there no real? Do we have only copies of what we deem as the real? Maybe an inevitable banality of this process is that we cannot any longer distinguish between the real and the copy. That becomes a rather impossible or futile task, because the real has already been overwritten by the hyperreal through the interventions, through the mediations of the technology and the various forms of new advancements. We can perhaps use a number of examples from the contemporary to show how the aspect of hyperreality gets manifested in our everyday life. For example, a number of commentators, a number of journalists have referred to the 9/11 attack like a movie. To quote from a news report, it was the television commentators as well as those on the ground who resorted to a phrase book culled from cinema. It was like a movie. It was like Independence Day, the Hollywood movie. It was like Die Hard. No, Die Hard 2. Armageddon. So here we find that one of the most horrifying events of the 20th century is being compared to a movie-like situation, because the knowledge of horror, the knowledge of certain horrifying and terrifying events is also based on our knowledge of particular movies and the images that had been in circulation. Because even in the reportage of this horrifying event, the 9/11 attack, the image making, the superior technology, the embedded journalists, all of this takes the appearance of a cinema. And this is something that we need to engage with, because there is no way in which one could escape from these ways through which reality is being overwritten by hyperreal images. And similarly, at the home front, we also saw how the 26/11 Mumbai attacks were also being framed in a similar way, because our knowledge of commando action of 26/11 is based on a simulation of it that we have seen in films or in televised images. And here the reality that we grasp is also circulated through the media images which are being made accessible to us. It could be real images or even the images which were in circulation through various other recorded televised means. And many of these instances could be used to talk about the excessive influence of the media and screen cultures and the ways in which they've begun to mediate our access to reality and also our knowledge of reality to a very large extent. Coming back to a discussion on Baudrillard and his notion of hyperreality, he also identifies a capitalist link, an urban capitalist link to this entire act of mediation, because urban capitalism, as Baudrillard puts it, has been successful in concealing the inequalities of society behind images of production, prosperity, and efficiency. And in that sense, we are left with such a situation that we know only the finished product. We do not know what is behind it. We do not know what is real behind the finished product. For example, in the modern capitalist sense, if we talk about a mango drink or the advertisements, the various aspects of its production which are being foregrounded, we know that our knowledge of the mango tree or even the mango plantation is through the sign or the representation of the mango on the bottle. It has got nothing to do with the real, as we know is behind the representation, because we do not and cannot attach a history, a culture, or a specific practice to that product which is being mediated through various technology, various representations, and various forms of technological enhancements. And in that sense, we could also talk about the example of a Christmas tree, a decorated Christmas tree in a living room, in which we are taking something real with an original and a natural quality and then exaggerating it into a perfection. Because one does not aspire to have a real pine tree in place of this decorated Christmas tree, which is only a copy of the real pine tree from the forest weathered over the years. And this aspiration for the exaggerated perfect image is also something which the postmodern mediation of technology does to our ideas of reality and our ideas of engaging with the real which is out in the world. Having said that, it is again important to reiterate the fact that the idea of hyperreality, the notion of simulation and simulacra, they do not exist merely as a theoretical and as intellectual framework, but they do have a bearing on the way the society is being mediated in the contemporary, in the postmodern period. So in the next session, we shall be taking a look at the various other aspects in which hyperreality is being talked about, the other critics and the other artists who also found this as a useful term to engage with to talk about contemporary reality. So on that note, we shall also be winding up today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.